October 15, 1943, Camp McCoy, Wisconsin. The scalding water cascaded over Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka's shoulders as he stood frozen in disbelief, his calloused hands trembling not from cold, but from the profound psychological shock of what he was experiencing. For 18 months, this veteran of Guadalcanal had survived on muddy rice, slept in waterlogged foxholes, and hadn't felt truly clean water touch his skin since leaving the home islands. Now, captured after the brutal fighting on Bougainville, he found himself in what could only be described as luxury that exceeded even the accommodations he had known as an officer in the Imperial Japanese Navy. The shower stall contained more hot water than his entire company had seen in 6 months of jungle warfare. Steam rose around him like incense in a Shinto shrine, carrying away not just the grime of combat, but challenging every assumption he had been taught about American weakness and degeneracy. The water pressure was constant, unlimited, wastefully abundant in a way that seemed impossible for a nation supposedly struggling to supply its forces across 2 oceans. Through the thin partition, he could hear other Japanese prisoners experiencing the same revelation, their surprised exclamations echoing off tile walls that gleamed with a cleanliness that would have impressed the most fastidious Tokyo hotel. What Lieutenant Tanaka and the 147 other Japanese prisoners arriving at Camp McCoy that autumn could not have known was that they were witnessing the manifestation of American industrial abundance that would prove more psychologically devastating than any military defeat. The hot water flowing endlessly over their bodies represented a production capacity so overwhelming that the United States could afford to provide captured enemies with living standards superior to what most Japanese soldiers had known even in peacetime. Each shower, each clean bed, each hot meal would become a data point in a massive psychological transformation that American intelligence officers were carefully documenting but never fully understood. The backstory of this extraordinary encounter began with a fundamental miscalculation that had shaped Japanese strategic thinking since Pearl Harbor. Emperor Hirohito's military advisors had convinced themselves that Americans, soft from material abundance, would collapse when faced with prolonged warfare. The plan was elegant in its simplicity: inflict such devastating casualties that the pleasure-seeking American public would demand peace rather than endure the sacrifices necessary for total victory. Japanese intelligence had studied American society extensively, noting the emphasis on individual comfort, the reluctance to accept heavy casualties, the presumed inability of a democratic society to sustain the brutal discipline required for modern industrial warfare. This assessment seemed logical based on Japan's understanding of its enemy. Americans appeared obsessed with personal hygiene, comfortable housing, abundant food, and material luxuries that Japanese soldiers were trained to despise as signs of spiritual weakness. Surely a people who required hot baths and soft beds could never match the fanatical determination of warriors prepared to die for their emperor. The contrast seemed stark and decisive: Japanese spiritual purity and willingness to sacrifice against American material decadence and individual selfishness. Victory was mathematically certain for the E side with superior spiritual discipline. But Lieutenant Tanaka's shower experience was revealing a terrifying paradox that would reshape every Japanese prisoner's understanding of their enemy. The Americans were not providing hot water and clean facilities despite their war effort, but because of it. The industrial capacity that supplied endless hot showers to enemy prisoners was the same system that produced Liberty ships faster than submarines could sink them, manufactured aircraft at rates that made Japanese production look artisanal, and delivered ammunition to frontline units in quantities that seemed criminally wasteful to soldiers accustomed to counting every cartridge. The water continued flowing as Tanaka stood motionless, his engineer's mind beginning to grasp the implications. This was not emergency conservation. This was not temporary abundance being squandered before inevitable shortages. This was standard operating procedure for a nation whose industrial capacity was so overwhelming that providing luxury accommodations for prisoners represented a rounding error in their resource calculations. The soap provided was higher quality than what Japanese officers purchased with their own money. The towels were thicker than anything he had owned as a civilian. The entire facility had been constructed specifically for prisoners, representing an investment in enemy comfort that exceeded most Japanese military installations' total budgets. As steam filled the shower room, Lieutenant Tanaka experienced what would later be documented as the first stage of ideological collapse syndrome, the systematic demolition of core beliefs through exposure to contradictory evidence. He had entered the camp convinced of American weakness, expecting harsh treatment that would confirm Japanese propaganda about Western brutality and hypocrisy. Instead, he was being pampered in facilities that demonstrated industrial abundance beyond his comprehension. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming, creating psychological stress that would prove more effective than any interrogation technique. The hot water was merely the beginning. Beyond the shower room waited clean beds with thick mattresses, electric heating, abundant food prepared in quantities that allowed for waste, medical facilities equipped with supplies that were scarce even in Japanese hospitals, and recreational opportunities that seemed incredible for a detention facility. Each element would challenge Japanese assumptions about American character, industrial capacity, and ultimate military potential. The transformation would be documented, measured, and analyzed, but its full implications would become clear only as thousands of prisoners underwent similar psychological evolution. Lieutenant Tanaka finally reached for the soap, his hands moving mechanically, while his mind struggled to process what he was experiencing. The simple act of washing represented the first crack in a worldview that had seemed unshakable hours earlier. As hot water continued flowing in seemingly unlimited quantities, he began to understand that Japan had not simply miscalculated American military strength. They had completely misunderstood the nature of industrial warfare itself, mistaking abundance for weakness and discovering too late that material prosperity was not the enemy of military effectiveness, but its foundation. The transformation continued as Lieutenant Tanaka emerged from the shower room, wrapped in a towel that was softer and more absorbent than any textile he had encountered in military service. The path to the sleeping quarters led through corridors lit by electric bulbs that burned continuously, without regard for energy conservation that had become second nature to Japanese forces operating under strict resource limitations. The floors gleamed with a polish that reflected the overhead lighting, maintained by prisoners who had volunteered for cleaning duties, not because they were compelled, but because the work provided structure and purpose in an environment that defied every expectation of captivity. The sleeping quarters themselves represented another psychological blow to Japanese preconceptions about American military efficiency. Each prisoner was assigned an individual cot with a steel frame, spring mattress, pillow, and wool blankets manufactured to military specifications that exceeded civilian standards in wartime Japan. The barracks were heated by a central system that maintained comfortable temperatures regardless of Wisconsin's brutal winter conditions. Windows were fitted with glass that sealed properly, preventing drafts that had made military accommodations throughout the Pacific Theater exercises in endurance rather than rest. What struck Lieutenant Tanaka most forcefully was the mathematical impossibility of what he was witnessing. Camp McCoy housed approximately 3,000 Japanese prisoners by late 1943, each provided with accommodations that would have been considered luxurious for officers in the Imperial Japanese Navy. The blankets alone represented more wool than entire Japanese army units possessed. The heating system consumed more fuel daily than his destroyer had allocated for a week of patrol operations. The maintenance of such facilities required a logistics apparatus that could sustain abundance on a scale that contradicted everything Japanese intelligence had concluded about American industrial limitations. Sergeant Kenji Yamamoto, captured on Attu after the brutal fighting that eliminated the entire Japanese garrison, occupied the cot adjacent to Tanaka's position. His background as a factory worker in Osaka provided a different perspective on what they were experiencing, but his conclusions were equally disturbing. The quality of construction in the barracks, the precision of the heating system, the durability of the furnishings, all spoke to an industrial base operating at efficiency, levels that Japanese manufacturing had never achieved even during peacetime production. Cycles. The bedding itself told a story that both prisoners would spend weeks attempting to comprehend. The mattresses were manufactured specifically for military use, designed to provide comfort while remaining durable enough for institutional service. The springs were individually wrapped, a manufacturing technique that required machinery and metallurgical expertise that Japanese industry had struggled to master even for civilian application. The fabric was woven to specifications that prioritized longevity over cost, suggesting an economic system that could afford quality materials for temporary accommodations. But the psychological impact extended beyond material comfort to something more fundamental. About American military culture, Japanese prisoners had been conditioned to expect harsh treatment based on their own army's approach to captured enemies and the warrior code that demanded stoic acceptance of suffering. The discovery that Americans provided enemy prisoners with living conditions superior to those enjoyed by many Japanese civilians represented a philosophical challenge that attacked the foundation of their military indoctrination. The evening meal service provided another devastating revelation about American abundance. Prisoners were escorted to a dining hall equipped with tables, chairs, and place settings that would have been appropriate for a civilian restaurant. The kitchen staff, consisting of American soldiers supervised by trained cooks, served portions that seemed excessive by Japanese military standards. Fresh vegetables, meat prepared according to nutritional guidelines, bread baked daily, and dairy products that had been luxury items in wartime Japan were provided as standard rations for enemy prisoners. Lieutenant Tanaka calculated the daily food allocation and reached conclusions that challenged his understanding of logistics warfare. Each prisoner received approximately 3,200 calories daily, distributed across 3 meals with nutritional balance that exceeded Japanese military rations provided to active combat units. The waste was staggering by Japanese standards. Prisoners who could not finish their portions simply discarded the excess, a practice that would have resulted in severe punishment in the Imperial Japanese Navy. Yet the kitchen staff showed no concern about such waste, suggesting that food abundance was so complete that disposal of excess represented normal operations rather than criminal negligence. The variety was equally impressive and psychologically disturbing. Fresh fruit appeared regularly, transported from distant growing regions despite wartime transportation priorities. Coffee was served at every meal, genuine coffee, rather than the grain substitutes that had become standard throughout Japan. Sugar was available without rationing, used freely to sweeten beverages in quantities that would have supported entire Japanese units for weeks. The casual abundance suggested an agricultural and transportation system operating at capacity levels that made rationing unnecessary rather than an act of unusual generosity toward prisoners. Sergeant Yamamoto, whose factory experience included production scheduling and resource allocation, began calculating the implications of what they were consuming. The transportation network required to deliver fresh food to a prisoner camp in Wisconsin implied logistics capabilities that exceeded anything Japanese forces had achieved even during the peak of their territorial expansion. The refrigeration systems necessary to preserve dairy products and fresh meat suggested electrical generating capacity that was being allocated to prisoner comfort rather than essential war production. The medical facilities provided the most shocking revelation about American resource priorities. Each prisoner received a complete physical examination upon arrival, conducted by trained medical personnel using equipment that was superior to what most Japanese civilian hospitals possessed. Dental care was provided without charge, including procedures that would have been expensive private treatments in pre-war Japan. Prescription medications were dispensed freely, including supplies of drugs that had become unavailable to Japanese forces due to resource shortages and transportation difficulties. The psychological impact of medical abundance proved particularly devastating to Japanese prisoners whose units had suffered from inadequate medical support throughout the Pacific Campaign. The knowledge that captured enemies received better medical care than active Japanese soldiers created cognitive dissonance that challenged fundamental assumptions about American priorities and values. The discovery that such medical care was considered routine rather than exceptional suggested industrial capacity devoted to humanitarian concerns that seemed impossible during total warfare. As Lieutenant, Tanaka settled into his assigned cot that first evening, surrounded by comfort that exceeded his civilian experience. He began confronting the mathematical reality of American industrial strength. The resources devoted to prisoner comfort represented a tiny fraction of total American production, yet exceeded the entire logistics capability of Japanese forces in many categories. The implications were terrifying for someone trained to calculate military potential through resource analysis. The morning routine at Camp McCoy provided Japanese prisoners with their first systematic exposure to American military organization that operated on principles fundamentally different from Imperial Japanese Army doctrine. Reveille sounded at 600 hours, but instead of the harsh discipline and immediate work assignments that characterized Japanese military life, prisoners were given time to wash, dress, and prepare for breakfast in an atmosphere that seemed almost relaxed by military standards. The guards, mostly American soldiers who had volunteered for prisoner duty, maintained professional distance while showing none of the brutality that Japanese prisoners had been conditioned to expect from captors. Lieutenant Tanaka observed the WWII breakfast service with the analytical precision of a naval officer, trained in logistics evaluation. The American mess hall operated with mechanical efficiency that would have impressed Japanese military observers, but the resources devoted to the operation defied comprehension. Industrial coffee urns produced enough beverage to serve all prisoners with seconds available for those who requested additional serving. The bread was baked fresh daily in ovens that consumed fuel quantities that would have supported cooking operations for entire Japanese battalions. Eggs were served in portions that suggested unlimited supply chain, stretching back to agricultural regions that continued operating at peacetime capacity despite global warfare. Theater waste remained the most psychologically disturbing aspect of the operation. American kitchen staff scraped untouched food into disposal containers without apparent concern about resource conservation. Bread rolls were discarded if they showed minor imperfections. Coffee was poured out and replaced if it sat too long, rather than being conserved as precious commodity. The casual disposal of food that would have sustained Japanese soldiers for days created profound psychological impact on prisoners who had been trained to view such waste as criminal negligence punishable by severe discipline. Sergeant Yamamoto, whose pre-war experience in industrial management provided insight into production systems, began calculating the agricultural and transportation capacity required to sustain such operations across thousands of American military installations. The mathematics were staggering and pointed to agricultural productivity that exceeded Japanese food production by orders of magnitude. The transportation network necessary to deliver fresh food consistently to remote locations, like Camp McCoy, suggested logistics capabilities that could simultaneously support massive overseas military operations while maintaining abundance for domestic populations and even enemy prisoners. The recreational facilities provided another window into American resource allocation that challenged Japanese assumptions about wartime priorities. The camp included a library stocked with books in English and Japanese, recreational equipment for sports activities, and workshops where prisoners could engage in handicrafts and educational pursuits. The investment in prisoner intellectual and physical welfare seemed to contradict everything Japanese military doctrine taught about the necessity of harsh discipline and resource conservation during wartime emergencies. Most disturbing was the discovery that these facilities were not exceptional gestures of American propaganda, but standard operating procedures mandated by military regulations that treated prisoner welfare as a routine administrative responsibility. The Geneva Convention requirements were exceeded rather than merely satisfied. suggesting a military culture that emphasized systematic care for enemy personnel as evidence of superior organizational capacity rather than weakness or sentimentality. The heating system provided a particularly striking example of American industrial abundance applied to prisoner comfort. Wisconsin winters reached temperatures that would have created survival emergencies for Japanese forces accustomed to tropical and temperate climates. Yet, Camp McCoy maintained interior temperatures that allowed prisoners to remain comfortable in light clothing, consuming fuel quantities that would have supported heating for entire Japanese cities. The system operated automatically, maintained by technical personnel who ensured consistent performance without apparent concern about energy conservation. Lieutenant Tanaka's naval engineering background enabled him to estimate the coal consumption required for such heating operations, and his calculations revealed logistics capabilities that seemed impossible based on Japanese understanding of American transportation systems. The coal had to be mined, transported across hundreds of miles, and delivered to the camp on schedule regardless of weather conditions or competing military priorities. The infrastructure required for such operations suggested an industrial base, operating at efficiency levels that made resource allocation to prisoner comfort economically feasible rather than strategically costly. The medical care continued to provide psychological shocks that undermined Japanese preconceptions about American military priorities. Daily sick call was conducted by trained medical personnel who treated minor ailments with attention and supplies that would have been reserved for serious cases in Japanese military medicine. Prescription medications were dispensed without rationing, including drugs that had become unavailable to Japanese forces due to supply shortages and transportation difficulties. Dental care proved particularly impressive to prisoners whose units had operated without dental support throughout the Pacific Campaign. American military dentists provided routine cleanings, fillings, and even orthodontic work that would have been expensive private treatment in pre-war Japan. The equipment was modern, the supplies abundant, and the care provided according to standards that exceeded what most Japanese civilians could access even during peacetime conditions. The psychological impact of superior medical treatment for captured enemies created cognitive dissonance that challenged fundamental assumptions about American character and military doctrine. Japanese prisoners had been taught that Americans were individually selfish and would prioritize personal comfort over military effectiveness. The discovery that American military medical services provided better care for enemy prisoners than Japanese forces received contradicted core beliefs about national character and institutional priorities. Educational opportunities provided another dimension of American abundance that seemed impossible during total warfare. Prisoners could attend English language classes taught by qualified instructors, participate in technical training programs that provided marketable skills, and access library materials that included both recreational reading and serious academic texts. The investment in prisoner education suggested a long-term perspective on post-war relations that seemed inconsistent with the brutal warfare being conducted across the Pacific theater. The Tantutitwand workshops equipped for handicraft production demonstrated American industrial capacity in microcosm. Tools were provided without apparent concern about security risks. Materials were available in quantities that allowed for experimentation and waste, and finished products could be kept by prisoners or sent to family members through mail services that operated with remarkable efficiency, despite wartime communication restrictions. The casual provision of metalworking tools, wood, and other materials to enemy prisoners suggested industrial abundance that made such security concerns negligible compared to the psychological benefits of keeping prisoners occupied and productive. As Lieutenant Tanaka settled into the routine of camp life, he began documenting observations in a diary that would later provide historians with detailed records of the psychological transformation experienced by Japanese prisoners exposed to American abundance. Each day brought new revelations about industrial capacity that exceeded Japanese preconceptions by margins that seemed impossible based on pre-war intelligence estimates. The hot showers, clean beds, abundant food, And comprehensive medical care were not propaganda gestures or temporary accommodations, but standard operating procedures that reflected systematic abundance rather than exceptional treatment. The mathematical implications were becoming clear to prisoners, whose military training included logistics analysis and resource planning. America was not straining to provide luxury accommodations for enemy prisoners. They were demonstrating industrial surplus capacity that made prisoner comfort economically insignificant compared to total production capabilities. The psychological transformation accelerated during Lieutenant Tanaka's second week at Camp McCoy, when prisoners were introduced to the camp's recreation program, a systematic approach to prisoner welfare that revealed American organizational capabilities extending far beyond basic sustenance and shelter. The recreation officer, Captain William Henderson, had been a high school principal in civilian life and approached prisoner activities with the same methodical planning that had characterized his educational career. His briefing to new arrivals outlined opportunities that seemed impossible in a military detention facility: organized sports leagues, hobby workshops, musical instruments, and even a prisoner-operated newsletter that was printed using camp facilities and distributed without censorship of content unrelated to security matters. The sports equipment alone represented an investment that challenged Japanese understanding of American resource priorities. Baseball gloves, bats, and balls were provided in sufficient quantities to equip multiple teams, with replacements available when equipment wore out through normal use. The baseball diamond had been constructed by prisoner volunteers using materials and tools provided by camp administration, creating a playing field that met official specifications and included bleachers for spectators. The casual provision of recreation equipment that would have been luxury items in wartime Japan suggested industrial capacity devoted to prisoner morale that exceeded the total recreation budget for most Japanese military units. Sergeant Yamamoto found himself drawn to the woodworking shop, where American guards supervised prisoners using tools that included power saws, drill presses, and finishing equipment that would have been valuable industrial assets in resource-constrained Japan. The lumber was provided without rationing, allowing prisoners to undertake projects that would have been impossible due to material shortages in their homeland. The casual waste of wood shavings and sawdust, simply swept up and discarded rather than collected for fuel or other uses, demonstrated abundance that seemed criminal by Japanese standards of wartime resource conservation. The psychological impact of unlimited materials extended beyond simple comfort to fundamental questions about American industrial philosophy. Japanese prisoners had been trained to view resource conservation as a moral virtue and waste as evidence of spiritual corruption. The discovery that Americans could afford to provide enemy prisoners with unlimited access to materials suggested either massive resource abundance or fundamental indifference to conservation principles that Japanese military doctrine considered essential for national survival. Trade music program provided another window into American organizational culture that operated according to principles foreign to Japanese military experience. Instruments were available for prisoners who demonstrated musical ability, including guitars, harmonicas, and even a piano that had been donated by a local civic organization. Sheet music was provided in both English and Japanese, with prisoners encouraged to perform both traditional songs from their homeland and American popular music as part of cultural exchange programs designed to reduce tension and promote understanding between former enemies. Lieutenant Tanaka, who had studied violin as a child, found himself participating in informal concerts that drew audiences of both prisoners and American staff. The experience of performing Japanese traditional music for American guards who listened respectfully and applauded enthusiastically created cognitive dissonance that challenged preconceptions about American cultural attitudes toward Japanese civilization. The guards' genuine interest in Japanese musical traditions contradicted propaganda that had portrayed Americans as culturally shallow people, incapable of appreciating sophisticated artistic expression. The camp newsletter, titled McCoy Messenger, demonstrated American commitment to prisoner welfare that extended to intellectual stimulation and creative expression. Prisoners were encouraged to submit articles, poetry, and artwork for publication, with editorial decisions made by a prisoner committee operating under minimal American supervision. The printing equipment was operated by prisoners who had been trained by American technical personnel, creating a publication that maintained professional standards while allowing for genuine expression of prisoner thoughts and experiences. The newsletter's content provided insight into the psychological transformation occurring among Japanese prisoners exposed to American abundance. Early editions contained articles that maintained traditional perspectives on honor, duty, and loyalty to the emperor. But subsequent issues showed evolution toward more complex views that acknowledged American capabilities while struggling to maintain coherence with previous beliefs. The gradual shift in editorial tone documented the ideological confusion experienced by prisoners whose direct experience contradicted official Japanese assessments of American character and industrial capacity. The camp library represented perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of American prisoner welfare programs, with collections that included technical manuals, literary works, historical texts, and current periodicals in both English and Japanese. The Japanese language materials had been acquired through complex negotiations with neutral countries, and translated works prepared specifically for prisoner education programs. The investment in intellectual resources for enemy prisoners suggested long-term planning that seemed inconsistent with the brutal warfare being conducted. Across the Pacific Theater, Lieutenant Tanaka found himself drawn to technical manuals that described American industrial processes and engineering techniques. The information was provided without apparent concern about security implications, suggesting either massive confidence in American technological superiority or fundamental indifference to the possibility that such knowledge might benefit enemy forces. The casual availability of detailed technical information that would have been classified secrets in Japanese military libraries demonstrated intellectual abundance that paralleled the material prosperity evident throughout the camp. The medical library proved particularly revealing about American scientific capabilities and resource allocation to prisoner welfare. Medical texts were current, comprehensive, and included research findings that were years ahead of Japanese medical knowledge in many areas. The camp physician, Dr. Robert Martinez, had been a professor at Johns Hopkins Medical School before military service and maintained professional standards that exceeded what most Japanese prisoners had experienced as civilians. His willingness to share medical knowledge with prisoner physicians created educational opportunities that seemed impossible during wartime conditions. Educational classes provided systematic exposure to American technical and cultural achievements that challenged Japanese preconceptions about Western civilization's capability for sophisticated intellectual development. English language instruction was provided by qualified teachers who used modern pedagogical methods that were more effective than traditional Japanese educational techniques. Mathematics and science courses covered subjects that had been restricted to elite institutions in Japan, made available to prisoners regardless of their previous educational background or social status. The vocational training programs demonstrated American planning for post-war reconstruction that assumed eventual Japanese defeat, and the necessity of preparing former enemies for productive civilian life. Prisoners could learn automotive mechanics, electrical work, carpentry, and other skilled trades using equipment and materials that exceeded what was available in many Japanese technical schools. The investment in prisoner skills development suggested confidence in ultimate victory, combined with humanitarian concern for former enemies that seemed inconsistent with the total warfare being conducted across the Pacific. As weeks passed, Lieutenant Tanaka found himself participating in activities that would have been impossible in Japanese military service and luxury even in civilian life. The gradual accumulation of small comforts and intellectual stimulation created psychological dependence on American systems that provided abundance without apparent strain or sacrifice. The realization that such treatment was standard rather than exceptional suggested industrial and organizational capabilities. that made Japanese resistance mathematically futile regardless of spiritual determination or tactical skill. The transformation was documented through letters home that were subject to censorship but allowed considerable latitude for personal expression. Japanese families received descriptions of prisoner conditions that contradicted official Japanese assessments of American weakness and suggested alternative interpretations of the war's likely outcome. The psychological impact of American abundance reached its crescendo during Lieutenant Tanaka's third week at Camp McCoy when prisoners were introduced to the camp's mail system, a logistical miracle that demonstrated American organizational capabilities on a global scale that defied Japanese comprehension of wartime communication possibilities. Letters from home arrived with stunning regularity, despite the thousands of miles separating Wisconsin from Japanese prison camps where American servicemen were held, suggesting postal coordination between enemies that seemed impossible during total warfare yet functioned with mechanical precision that exceeded peacetime. Commercial mail service. The letters themselves revealed information that challenged Japanese prisoners' understanding of conditions in their homeland. Family members wrote about food shortages, rationing systems that had reduced civilian meals to subsistence levels, and industrial conscription that had removed most able-bodied men from agricultural and manufacturing work. The contrast with their own abundant meals, comfortable accommodations, and recreational opportunities created cognitive dissonance that attacked fundamental assumptions about national strength and warfighting capability. Japanese civilians were suffering privation, while captured Japanese soldiers enjoyed luxury that exceeded pre-war standards. For most social classes, Sergeant Yamamoto received correspondence from his wife, describing factory conditions in Osaka where production had declined due to material shortages, equipment failures, and the replacement of skilled workers with hastily trained women and elderly men. Her letters described work shifts extended to 12 hours daily, food rations reduced to barely adequate levels, and coal shortages that left civilian homes unheated during winter months. The detailed accounts of hardship endured by Japanese civilians created devastating psychological impact when contrasted with the heated barracks. Abundant food and recreational facilities provided to Japanese prisoners by their captors. The mail system itself demonstrated logistical capabilities that seemed impossible based on Japanese understanding of wartime transportation priorities. Letters written by prisoners reached their destinations in Japan within 4 to 6 weeks, traveling through multiple military postal systems, neutral country intermediaries, and civilian mail services that continued operating despite submarine warfare and strategic bombing campaigns. The reliability of mail delivery suggested communication networks that remained functional regardless of military operations, indicating infrastructure resilience that exceeded Japanese capabilities even during peacetime conditions. More disturbing were the packages that arrived containing personal items sent by family members, including photographs, traditional foods, and handicrafts that connected prisoners with their cultural heritage while demonstrating the futility of Japanese attempts to disrupt American supply lines. The packages traveled the same routes as military supplies, sharing transportation capacity that seemed unlimited despite the massive logistics requirements of global warfare. The casual inclusion of prisoner mail in military transportation suggested surplus capacity that made civilian communication economically insignificant compared to total logistical capabilities. The censorship system revealed another dimension of American organizational sophistication that operated according to principles foreign to Japanese military experience. Letters were reviewed by translators who understood Japanese language and culture, but censorship focused narrowly on security-related information while allowing remarkable latitude for personal expression and even criticism of American policies. The intellectual freedom permitted to enemy prisoners exceeded what Japanese soldiers enjoyed when writing to their own families, suggesting confidence in American systems that made dissent harmless rather than dangerous to military effectiveness. Lieutenant Tanaka found himself writing longer letters as weeks passed, describing experiences that would have seemed impossible based on pre-war Japanese assessments of American character and capabilities. His correspondence documented the gradual evolution of his thinking as direct experience contradicted official propaganda about American weakness and brutality. The letters became inadvertent intelligence, reports that provided Japanese families with information about American industrial capacity and organizational efficiency that challenged official assessments of the war's likely outcome. The medical care continued to provide psychological shocks that undermined Japanese preconceptions about American priorities and resource allocation. Prisoners received dental work that included expensive procedures like root canals and crown installations that would have been luxury treatments in pre-war Japan. The casual provision of such medical care to enemy prisoners suggested healthcare systems operating at capacity levels that made elaborate treatment economically feasible rather than strategically costly. American military physicians treated Japanese prisoners with attention and resources that exceeded what Japanese military medical services provided to their own personnel. The psychological examinations proved particularly revealing about American scientific approaches to prisoner management and human behavior analysis. Prisoners were interviewed by trained psychologists who studied the mental health impacts of captivity and cultural displacement, treating psychological welfare as seriously as physical health. The sophisticated understanding of human psychology applied to prisoner care suggested scientific capabilities and humanitarian concerns that seemed inconsistent with the brutal warfare being conducted across the Pacific Theater. Dr. Martinez established individual relationships with prisoner patients that transcended the formal doctor-patient interactions typical of military medicine. His genuine interest in Japanese culture and language created opportunities for cultural exchange that challenged preconceptions about American intellectual capacity and cultural sensitivity. The American physician's efforts to learn Japanese medical terminology and traditional healing practices demonstrated respect for enemy culture that contradicted propaganda portraying Americans as culturally arrogant people, incapable of appreciating sophisticated foreign civilizations. The dental clinic became a particularly powerful symbol of American abundance applied to prisoner welfare. The equipment was modern, the supplies unlimited, and the care provided according to standards that exceeded what most Japanese civilians could access even during peacetime conditions. Prisoners received routine cleanings, cavity fillings, and even cosmetic work that would have been expensive private treatment in pre-war Japan. The casual provision of high-quality dental care to captured enemies suggested medical resources that made such treatment economically insignificant compared to total healthcare capacity. The psychological impact extended beyond individual medical treatment to broader questions about American social organization and national priorities. Japanese prisoners had been taught that individualistic societies would prioritize personal comfort over collective welfare. Yet, they were experiencing collective care that exceeded individual treatment available in supposedly collectivist Japan. The contradiction challenged fundamental assumptions about the relationship between political systems and social welfare, suggesting that American democracy might be more effective at collective care than Japanese. Authoritarianism. The workshop activities provided another window into American technical education and resource abundance that seemed impossible during wartime conditions. Prisoners could access tools and materials for metalworking, electronics repair, and mechanical maintenance that exceeded what was available in Japanese technical schools. The casual provision of such equipment to enemy prisoners suggested industrial capacity that made security concerns negligible compared to the psychological benefits of keeping prisoners productively occupied. Lieutenant Tanaka found himself learning welding techniques using equipment that was superior to what he had access to as a naval officer in the Imperial Japanese Navy. The irony was not lost on him that enemy captors were providing technical education that exceeded what his own military had made available during active service. The experience created loyalty conflicts that challenged fundamental assumptions about duty, honor, and national allegiance when enemy treatment exceeded home country support. The gradual accumulation of comfort, education, and medical care created psychological dependence on American systems that seemed more reliable and generous than Japanese military support had ever been. Prisoners began anticipating meals, recreational activities, and educational opportunities, with enthusiasm that felt treasonous yet irresistible. The transformation reached a critical threshold during Lieutenant Tanaka's fourth week at Camp McCoy, when American officials introduced prisoners-to-work programs that revealed the most devastating truth about American industrial philosophy: the casual integration of enemy labor into production systems that operated with such overwhelming capacity that Japanese prisoners could contribute meaningfully to the American war effort while simultaneously receiving treatment superior to what they had known as active combatants for their own nation. The work assignments were voluntary, paid according to Geneva Convention standards, and conducted using equipment and materials that exceeded what most Japanese factories possessed. Even during peacetime operations, the agricultural work details provided the most direct exposure to American farming methods that challenged Japanese understanding of food production capabilities and resource allocation. Prisoners assigned to local dairy farms discovered mechanical milking systems, automated feeding equipment, and veterinary care for livestock that exceeded the medical attention many Japanese soldiers had received during active combat service. The casual abundance of animal feed, veterinary supplies, and farming equipment suggested agricultural systems operating at efficiency levels that made food shortages mathematically impossible regardless of wartime disruptions to civilian distribution networks. Sergeant Yamamoto found himself working at a cheese processing facility where industrial equipment produced dairy products in quantities that would have supplied entire Japanese cities. The machinery was American manufactured, operated by workers who had received training that exceeded what Japanese technical schools provided, and maintained using replacement parts that were available without rationing, despite wartime material priorities. The casual waste of milk products that failed quality standards demonstrated abundance that seemed criminal by Japanese standards of resource conservation, yet represented normal operations for systems that could afford to prioritize quality over quantity. The psychological impact of witnessing American agricultural abundance proved more devastating than combat defeats, because it challenged fundamental assumptions about national survival capabilities and resource security. Japanese prisoners had been taught that their island nation's limited agricultural capacity required territorial expansion to secure food supplies for national survival. The discovery that American agricultural systems produced such abundance that quality concerns took precedence over quantity suggested industrial farming capabilities that made territorial conquest unnecessary for national food security. The manufacturing work assignments provided even more disturbing insights into American industrial capacity and organizational efficiency. Prisoners worked in factories producing military equipment, civilian goods, and industrial components using assembly line techniques that achieved production rates exceeding Japanese manufacturing capabilities by orders of magnitude. The machinery was maintained to standards that exceeded Japanese industrial practices, operated by workers whose skills reflected training programs that were more comprehensive than Japanese technical education, and supplied with raw materials that arrived on schedule regardless of transportation disruptions caused by submarine warfare. Lieutenant Tanaka was assigned to a facility producing radio components for military communication systems, where he discovered manufacturing precision that exceeded Japanese electronics production despite the facility's classification as a secondary supplier rather than a premium defense contractor. The quality control standards rejected components that would have been acceptable in Japanese military production, demonstrating manufacturing philosophy that prioritized reliability over resource conservation. The casual rejection of functional components that failed to meet exacting specifications suggested industrial capacity that could afford perfectionism rather than accepting adequate performance. The training provided to prisoner workers demonstrated American educational capabilities, that seemed impossible during wartime conditions when most nations were reducing civilian education to focus resources on military production. Japanese prisoners received technical instruction that exceeded what they had available in their homeland, using modern pedagogical methods that were more effective than traditional Japanese educational techniques. The investment in enemy education suggested long-term planning that assumed eventual Japanese defeat and the necessity of preparing former combatants for productive post-war civilian roles. Tools and equipment provided for prisoner work assignments represented American manufacturing capabilities in microcosm. Hand tools were precision manufactured to tolerances that exceeded Japanese military specifications. Power tools operated with reliability that Japanese industry struggled to achieve, and replacement parts were available without rationing, despite wartime material priorities. The casual provision of high-quality tools to enemy prisoners suggested manufacturing capacity that made such equipment economically insignificant compared to total industrial production capabilities. The safety regulations governing prisoner work assignments revealed American industrial philosophy that treated worker welfare as an integral component of production efficiency, rather than an impediment to maximum output. Safety equipment was provided without cost. Training emphasized accident prevention rather than production quotas, and medical care was available for work-related injuries without regard to the prisoner status of injured workers. The systematic attention to worker safety suggested industrial systems that could afford to prioritize human welfare over maximum short-term production. The wage system for prisoner labor provided another psychological shock that challenged Japanese understanding of enemy character and military priorities. Prisoners received payment according to Geneva Convention standards, but the amounts exceeded what Japanese soldiers earned during active military service. The wages could be used to purchase additional food, personal items, and recreational materials from camp stores that were stocked with goods that had become luxury items in wartime Japan. The casual provision of consumer goods to enemy prisoners suggested retail distribution systems that continued operating at near peacetime capacity despite global warfare. The work supervision demonstrated American management techniques that achieved higher productivity through worker cooperation rather than harsh discipline and fear-based motivation that characterized Japanese industrial management. American supervisors treated prisoner workers with professional respect, provided constructive feedback rather than punishment for mistakes, and encouraged innovation and efficiency improvements that benefited both production goals and worker satisfaction. The management philosophy suggested industrial culture that achieved superior results through positive motivation rather than coercive discipline. The transportation system supporting prisoner work assignments provided another window into American logistical capabilities that operated on scales that defied Japanese comprehension of wartime resource allocation. Prisoners were transported to work sites using vehicles that consumed fuel quantities that would have supported Japanese military operations, yet the transportation was considered routine administrative expense rather than strategic resource allocation. The casual use of motor vehicles for prisoner convenience suggested petroleum abundance that made fuel conservation unnecessary rather than virtuous. The interaction with civilian American workers provided Japanese prisoners with direct exposure to the social systems that generated American industrial superiority. Civilian workers earned wages that exceeded Japanese military officers' salaries, lived in housing that would have been upper-class accommodation in Japan, and enjoyed personal freedoms that seemed inconsistent with the discipline required for effective war production. Yet, these individually comfortable workers achieved collective productivity that exceeded Japanese industrial output despite operating without the harsh discipline that Japanese managers considered essential for maximum efficiency. The psychological transformation accelerated as prisoners began understanding that American abundance was not temporary wartime prosperity that would collapse under pressure, but systematic industrial capacity that operated according to principles fundamentally different from Japanese economic organization. The discovery that individual worker welfare contributed to rather than detracted from collective productivity, challenged core assumptions about the relationship between personal comfort and national strength that had shaped Japanese military and political philosophy for decades. The psychological demolition intensified during Lieutenant Tanaka's 5th week at Camp McCoy, when prisoners were introduced to American technology in its most casual applications. Routine administrative systems that demonstrated computational capabilities and organizational efficiency that exceeded Japanese military operations at their most sophisticated levels. Every morning, prisoners witnessed camp administrators using calculating machines, typewriters, and filing systems that processed information with mechanical precision that would have been impossible in Japanese military bureaucracy even during peacetime conditions. The casual deployment of advanced office equipment for routine prisoner administration suggested technological abundance that made complex information processing economically feasible for mundane administrative tasks. The camp's record-keeping system proved particularly devastating to Japanese preconceptions about American organizational capabilities and attention to individual welfare. Every prisoner's medical history, work assignments, educational progress, and personal preferences were maintained in detailed files that tracked individual circumstances with precision that exceeded Japanese military personnel records for their own officers. The systematic attention to individual prisoner welfare suggested administrative capacity that could afford personalized treatment for thousands of enemy captives while simultaneously managing global military operations requiring coordination across multiple theaters and millions of personnel. Sergeant Yamamoto, whose pre-war experience in factory administration provided insight into organizational systems, discovered that camp record-keeping employed techniques that were years ahead of Japanese business practices in accuracy, efficiency, and comprehensiveness. The filing systems used standardized procedures that enabled any administrator to locate specific information within minutes, contrasting sharply with Japanese bureaucratic methods that relied on personal knowledge and informal relationships to navigate complex administrative hierarchy. The systematic approach to information management suggested organizational philosophy that prioritized efficiency over personal authority and hierarchical control. The communications equipment supporting camp operations provided another window into American technological capabilities that seemed impossible based on Japanese understanding of electronic systems and industrial capacity. Radio communications connected Camp McCoy with military headquarters across North America and overseas commands with clarity and reliability that exceeded Japanese military communications even during optimal conditions. The casual use of long-distance radio communication for routine administrative matters suggested electronic manufacturing capacity that made sophisticated communication equipment economically feasible for secondary applications rather than being reserved exclusively for critical military operations. The telephone system demonstrated American infrastructure development that operated on scales that defied Japanese comprehension of national resource allocation and technical capability. Camp administrators maintained telephone communication with government offices, military commands, and civilian contractors across thousands of miles using networks that functioned with reliability that Japanese communication systems had never achieved, even for domestic calls within major cities. The systematic connectivity suggested infrastructure investment that treated long-distance communication as routine administrative necessity rather than strategic luxury available only for the most critical military coordination. Lieutenant Tanaka found himself observing camp photography sessions where American personnel documented prisoner activities using equipment and supplies that exceeded what Japanese military photographers possessed for official propaganda production. The cameras were precision instruments manufactured to specifications that reflected industrial capability in optics and mechanical engineering that Japanese industry had struggled to match even during peacetime conditions. The casual use of High-quality photographic equipment for routine documentation suggested manufacturing capacity that made sophisticated optical instruments economically feasible for secondary applications. The photographic processing facilities revealed another dimension of American technical capabilities that seemed impossible during wartime conditions, when most nations were concentrating scientific resources on weapons development and military applications. Camp personnel developed and printed photographs using chemicals and equipment that had become unavailable to Japanese civilian photographers due to wartime shortages. Yet American military bases possessed such materials in quantities sufficient for routine documentation of prisoner activities. The abundance of photographic supplies suggested chemical manufacturing capacity that could support both military requirements and secondary applications without resource conflicts. The educational materials provided for prisoner instruction demonstrated American publishing and information distribution capabilities that operated with efficiency that exceeded Japanese systems even during peacetime conditions. Textbooks were printed on high-quality paper using inks and binding materials that had become luxury items in wartime Japan. Yet American educational programs provided such materials to enemy prisoners without apparent concern about cost or resource conservation. The casual provision of high-quality educational materials suggested publishing industries that continued operating at near peacetime capacity, despite global warfare. The library expansion program provided the most systematic exposure to American intellectual resources and information management capabilities that challenged Japanese assumptions about Western cultural sophistication and scientific advancement. New books arrived regularly despite wartime transportation priorities, including current publications that demonstrated American intellectual productivity continuing at high levels despite massive military mobilization. The systematic acquisition of current publications for prisoner education suggested intellectual resources that made comprehensive library development economically feasible even for enemy captives. The technical manuals available in the camp library provided Japanese prisoners with detailed information about American industrial processes and engineering techniques that exceeded what was available in Japanese technical libraries even for their own engineers and scientists. The casual availability of such information suggested either massive confidence in technological superiority or fundamental indifference to security concerns about technical knowledge transfer. The willingness to share advanced technical information with enemy prisoners demonstrated intellectual abundance that paralleled the material prosperity evident throughout the camp operations. Thus, maintenance workshops supporting camp operations provided Japanese prisoners with direct exposure to American mechanical capabilities and industrial precision that exceeded their previous experience with machinery quality and reliability. Every piece of equipment was maintained to standards that exceeded Japanese military practices, using replacement parts that were available without rationing and tools that were manufactured to tolerances that Japanese industry struggled to achieve even for premium applications. The systematic maintenance of mechanical systems suggested manufacturing philosophy that prioritized long-term reliability over initial cost savings. The electrical systems powering camp operations demonstrated American infrastructure capabilities that seemed impossible based on Japanese understanding of power generation and distribution. During wartime conditions, electric power was available continuously without rationing or conservation measures, supporting heating, lighting, and mechanical systems that consumed energy quantities that would have powered entire Japanese military installations. The unlimited electrical power suggested generating capacity that made energy abundance possible rather than requiring the strict conservation measures that characterized Japanese wartime operations. The waste disposal systems revealed American resource abundance in its most stark form. The systematic discarding of materials that would have been valuable resources in Japan, processed through organized disposal systems that treated waste management as routine administrative responsibility rather than resource recovery opportunity. Food waste was collected and disposed of daily, rather than being recycled for animal feed or compost. Paper materials that could have been recycled were incinerated, and metal scraps that would have been valuable recycling. Materials in Japan were simply discarded as routine waste. The psychological impact of witnessing systematic waste disposal proved devastating to prisoners whose military training had emphasized resource conservation as moral virtue and waste as evidence of spiritual corruption. The discovery that Americans could afford to discard materials that would have been precious resources in Japan suggested abundance that made conservation unnecessary rather than virtuous, challenging fundamental assumptions about the relationship between resource management and national strength. The psychological transformation reached its most profound stage during Lieutenant Tanaka's 6th week at Camp McCoy, when prisoners experienced their first American holiday celebration, Thanksgiving 1943, an event that would shatter any remaining illusions about American resource limitations and reveal the true scale of abundance that made their comfortable captivity not an exception, but a routine expression of systematic prosperity that extended even to the treatment of enemy combatants. The preparation for this civilian holiday in a military prison camp demonstrated organizational capabilities and resource allocation that challenged every assumption Japanese prisoners had maintained about American priorities and national character. The menu planning alone represented a logistical undertaking that exceeded the complexity of Japanese military operations that had required months of preparation and coordination across multiple command levels. Camp administrators coordinated the delivery of fresh turkeys, vegetables, dairy products, and specialty ingredients from suppliers across the Midwest, creating supply chains that functioned with precision that Japanese quartermaster services had never achieved even for critical military operations during peacetime conditions. The casual coordination of complex logistics for prisoner entertainment suggested administrative capabilities that made elaborate celebration economically feasible rather than strategically costly. Sergeant Yamamoto participated in meal preparation under the supervision of American military cooks who demonstrated techniques and used equipment that exceeded what Japanese restaurant kitchens possessed even in luxury establishments serving wealthy civilian clients. Industrial ovens, mechanical mixers, and food preparation equipment operated with reliability and precision that Japanese commercial kitchens had struggled to achieve. Yet this sophisticated equipment was deployed for the routine purpose of preparing a single meal for enemy prisoners. The casual use of advanced kitchen equipment suggested manufacturing capacity that made commercial-grade food service equipment economically feasible for temporary applications. The quantities of food prepared for the Thanksgiving celebration defied Japanese comprehension of resource allocation. During wartime conditions, when most nations had implemented strict rationing systems that reduced civilian consumption to subsistence levels, each prisoner received portions that exceeded their normal abundant daily rations, with turkey, stuffing, vegetables, and desserts provided in quantities that would have supplied Japanese military units for days. The systematic overproduction of food for a single meal demonstrated agricultural abundance that made waste, economically, insignificant compared to the symbolic value of prisoner morale and cultural education. Lieutenant Tanaka calculated the resource investment represented by the Thanksgiving meal and reached conclusions that challenged his understanding of American economic systems and industrial capacity. The meat alone required livestock production systems that exceeded Japanese agricultural capabilities, transportation networks that could deliver fresh products across hundreds of miles without spoilage, and refrigeration systems that preserved food quality during extended storage and distribution. The systematic coordination of complex food production and distribution suggested agricultural industries that operated at efficiency levels that made elaborate meal preparation routine rather than exceptional. The decorations and atmosphere created for the celebration revealed American cultural sophistication that contradicted Japanese propaganda about Western intellectual limitations and artistic insensitivity. American personnel had researched Japanese aesthetic preferences and incorporated design elements that demonstrated respect for enemy cultural traditions while introducing American holiday customs that emphasized gratitude, community, and shared prosperity rather than military victory or national superiority. The cultural sensitivity displayed by camp personnel suggested educational systems that produced individuals capable of sophisticated cross-cultural understanding and diplomatic interaction. The invitation extended to Japanese prisoners to participate in American holiday traditions created psychological conflicts that challenged fundamental assumptions about loyalty, cultural identity, and appropriate relationships between enemies during wartime. Prisoners found themselves enjoying American food, participating in American customs, and experiencing genuine hospitality from personnel who treated them as honored guests rather than captured enemies. The cognitive dissonance between expected harsh treatment and actual generous hospitality created emotional confusion that attacked the foundations of their military indoctrination and national identity. The entertainment provided during the celebration demonstrated American recreational capabilities that seemed impossible during total warfare when most nations had eliminated non-essential activities to concentrate resources on military production. Live music was performed by American military personnel who possessed musical skills that would have been professional-level entertainment in Japanese civilian contexts, using instruments that were maintained in excellent condition despite their non-essential status for military operations. The systematic support for musical activities suggested cultural priorities that made artistic expression economically feasible. Even during global warfare, the photography and documentation of the celebration revealed American record-keeping capabilities that extended to the systematic preservation of prisoner experiences and cultural interactions that seemed unimportant for military purposes yet were treated as significant historical events worthy of professional documentation. The photographs were taken using equipment and processed using materials that exceeded what Japanese civilian photographers possessed. Yet American military personnel deployed such resources for the routine purpose of documenting prisoner activities. The systematic documentation suggested archival capabilities that made comprehensive record-keeping economically feasible for seemingly minor events. The gifts provided to prisoners during the celebration created the most profound psychological impact because they represented voluntary generosity that exceeded military necessity and contradicted every expectation of enemy treatment during wartime conditions. Personal items, including clothing, toiletries, and recreational materials, were distributed without regard to prisoner military rank or cooperative behavior, suggesting humanitarian concerns that prioritized individual welfare over strategic advantage or propaganda value. The unconditional generosity challenged assumptions about American character that had portrayed individual selfishness as a fundamental weakness that would prevent effective collective action. The letters home describing the Thanksgiving celebration created intelligence problems for Japanese authorities who received detailed accounts of American abundance and humanitarian treatment that contradicted official assessments of enemy weakness and brutality. Japanese families learned that their captured relatives were experiencing comfort and generosity that exceeded what many Japanese civilians enjoyed, creating psychological conflicts about national strength and war objectives that challenged support for continued resistance against enemies who demonstrated such overwhelming capacity for both warfare and humanitarian concern. The medical attention provided during the holiday period demonstrated American healthcare capabilities that operated according to principles foreign to Japanese military medicine and civilian health services. Prisoners received preventive medical care, routine health screenings, and attention to minor ailments that would have been ignored in Japanese military medical practice due to resource limitations and prioritization of serious combat injuries. The systematic attention to prisoner health suggested medical resources that made comprehensive health care economically feasible for individuals whose welfare had no strategic value for American military objectives. The psychological counseling made available to prisoners experiencing emotional distress from cultural displacement and captivity revealed American scientific understanding of human psychology and systematic approaches to mental health that exceeded Japanese medical knowledge and therapeutic techniques. Trained personnel provided individual attention to prisoners whose psychological adjustment problems would have been treated as character weaknesses, requiring harsh discipline in Japanese military culture. The sophisticated understanding of human psychology applied to enemy welfare suggested scientific capabilities and humanitarian concerns that seemed inconsistent with effective military organization. The educational opportunities expanded during the holiday period provided Japanese prisoners with access to American cultural knowledge and technical information that exceeded what was available in Japanese civilian educational institutions even during peacetime conditions. Libraries were supplemented with additional materials, classes were offered in subjects that had been restricted to elite institutions in Japan, and individual tutoring was provided for prisoners who demonstrated academic interest or aptitude. The investment in enemy education suggested long-term planning that assumed eventual peace and the value of cultural exchange between former enemies. The winter of 1943-44 brought Lieutenant Tanaka and his fellow prisoners face-to-face with the most devastating revelation about American industrial capacity: the casual deployment of advanced heating technology that maintained tropical comfort levels throughout Wisconsin's brutal winter season, consuming energy resources that would have powered entire Japanese cities, while treating such expenditure as routine administrative expense rather than strategic resource allocation. The heating systems operated continuously without conservation measures, maintaining interior temperatures that allowed prisoners to remain comfortable in light clothing, while outside temperatures dropped to levels that would have created survival emergencies for Japanese forces accustomed to temperate climates. The fuel consumption required for such heating operations challenged Japanese understanding of American petroleum resources and transportation capabilities during wartime conditions when most nations had implemented strict energy rationing to support military operations. Sergeant Yamamoto, whose industrial background enabled him to estimate energy requirements, calculated that Camp McCoy consumed more heating fuel daily than Japanese military installations received monthly. Yet American administrators showed no concern about fuel conservation or supply interruptions. The unlimited energy allocation suggested petroleum industries operating at capacity levels that made civilian comfort economically feasible, despite massive military fuel requirements for global operations. The maintenance of heating systems revealed American technical capabilities in mechanical engineering and industrial precision that exceeded Japanese manufacturing standards even for critical military equipment. Boilers, distribution systems, and control mechanisms operated with reliability that Japanese industrial systems had struggled to achieve, maintained by technical personnel whose skills reflected training programs that were more comprehensive than Japanese engineering education. The systematic maintenance of complex mechanical systems suggested manufacturing philosophy that prioritized long-term reliability over initial cost considerations and resource conservation. The clothing provided for winter conditions demonstrated American textile manufacturing capabilities and resource allocation that seemed impossible based on Japanese understanding of wartime production priorities and material availability. Each prisoner received winter clothing that included wool coats, insulated boots, warm hats, and gloves, manufactured to specifications that exceeded Japanese military winter equipment in quality, durability, and thermal protection. The casual provision of high-quality winter clothing to enemy prisoners suggested textile industries that could support both military requirements and humanitarian concerns without resource conflicts. Lieutenant Tanaka's naval engineering background enabled him to appreciate the technical sophistication of the heating control systems that automatically maintained optimal temperatures throughout the camp facilities using thermostatic controls, and mechanical distribution systems that operated without human intervention. The automated environmental control represented engineering capabilities that Japanese industrial facilities had never achieved, suggesting manufacturing expertise in precision mechanics and control systems that exceeded Japanese technical capabilities by significant margin. The deployment of advanced automation technology for prisoner comfort demonstrated industrial capacity that made sophisticated engineering economically feasible for secondary applications. The food service continued to provide psychological shocks that undermined Japanese preconceptions about American resource priorities and agricultural capabilities during winter conditions when most nations experienced seasonal shortages and reduced variety in available food products. Fresh vegetables, dairy products, and meat continued arriving in abundant quantities, despite transportation challenges created by severe weather conditions that would have disrupted Japanese supply systems completely. The reliability of food delivery suggested transportation networks that functioned regardless of weather conditions and agricultural systems that maintained production through seasonal variation. The recreational activities expanded during winter months provided Japanese prisoners with exposure to American leisure culture and individual freedom that challenged fundamental assumptions about the relationship between personal liberty and collective discipline required for effective military organization. Indoor sports facilities, hobby workshops, and social activities were available without restriction based on prisoner behavior or cooperation with camp authorities, suggesting philosophical approaches to human management that prioritized individual welfare over institutional control. The systematic support for prisoner recreation demonstrated resource allocation that made individual satisfaction economically feasible rather than strategically dangerous. The library services enhanced during winter months revealed American publishing capabilities and intellectual resources that operated at levels that exceeded Japanese educational institutions even during peacetime conditions when resource allocation favored academic and scientific development. New books arrived regularly despite winter transportation challenges, including current publications that demonstrated American intellectual productivity continuing at high levels despite global warfare. The systematic expansion of intellectual resources for prisoner education suggested publishing industries that maintained near peacetime operations while supporting massive military information requirements. The medical care intensified during winter months demonstrated American healthcare capabilities that operated according to principles that treated preventive medicine as routine rather than luxury available only for critical cases or elite personnel. Prisoners received flu vaccinations, vitamin supplements, and attention to minor health issues that would have been ignored in Japanese military medical practice due to resource limitations and prioritization of serious combat injuries. The systematic attention to prisoner health suggested medical industries that could afford comprehensive care for individuals whose welfare provided no strategic advantage for American military objectives. The psychological counseling expanded during winter isolation revealed American scientific understanding of human behavior and systematic approaches to mental health that exceeded Japanese knowledge of psychiatric medicine and therapeutic intervention techniques. Trained personnel provided individual attention to prisoners experiencing seasonal depression, cultural homesickness, and adjustment difficulties that would have been treated as character weaknesses, requiring harsh discipline in Japanese military culture. The sophisticated understanding of human psychology applied to enemy welfare suggested scientific capabilities that seemed inconsistent with the brutal efficiency required for global warfare. The work programs continued during winter conditions, provided Japanese prisoners with exposure to American industrial operations that functioned at full capacity regardless of seasonal weather challenges that would have reduced Japanese production significantly during comparable conditions. Manufacturing facilities maintained heating, lighting, and operational capability that allowed for consistent productivity despite external weather conditions that would have forced Japanese factories to reduce operations or shut down temporarily. The systematic maintenance of industrial operations suggested energy resources and infrastructure development that made weather-independent production economically feasible. The transportation systems supporting prisoner activities during winter demonstrated American logistical capabilities that operated on scales that defied Japanese comprehension of resource allocation and mechanical reliability during adverse weather conditions. Vehicles were equipped with heating systems, maintained in operational condition despite harsh weather exposure, and operated on schedule regardless of snow, ice, or temperature extremes that would have paralyzed Japanese transportation systems. The reliability of mechanical transportation suggested manufacturing quality and maintenance capabilities that made weather-independent operations routine rather than exceptional. The communication systems maintained during winter conditions revealed American electronic capabilities and infrastructure development that functioned with reliability that Japanese systems had never achieved even during optimal weather conditions. Radio communications, telephone connections, and mail delivery continued without interruption despite weather conditions that would have disrupted Japanese communication networks completely. The systematic maintenance of communication capability suggested electronic manufacturing and infrastructure investment that made reliable connectivity economically feasible regardless of environmental challenges. The waste disposal systems continued operating during winter, demonstrated American sanitation capabilities and resource allocation that treated waste management as essential public health service rather than optional convenience that could be reduced during difficult conditions. Garbage collection, sewage processing, and facility cleaning continued without reduction in service levels despite weather conditions that would have forced Japanese institutions to accept reduced sanitation standards. The systematic maintenance of sanitation services suggested infrastructure investment that made public health protection economically feasible, regardless of operational challenges. The spring of 1944 brought Lieutenant Tanaka and his fellow prisoners the most psychologically devastating revelation of their captivity: systematic exposure to American civilian life through organized visits to nearby communities, where they witnessed firsthand the prosperity and individual freedom that characterized American society even during total global warfare. These carefully supervised excursions revealed that the abundance they had experienced at Camp McCoy was not exceptional military accommodation, but representative of standard American living conditions that extended throughout civilian society, challenging every assumption about the relationship between individual comfort and national military effectiveness. The first community visit to the town of Sparta, Wisconsin, provided Japanese prisoners with direct observation of American civilian prosperity that exceeded their pre-war understanding of Western living standards and seemed impossible during wartime conditions when most nations had implemented strict rationing systems that reduced civilian consumption to survival levels. Main Street businesses operated with inventory levels that would have been luxury abundance in peacetime Japan, displaying consumer goods that had become unavailable to Japanese civilians due to military production priorities and resource shortages created by submarine warfare and strategic bombing campaigns. Sergeant Yamamoto found himself examining American consumer products in local stores that demonstrated manufacturing quality and variety that exceeded Japanese civilian goods even during peacetime conditions when domestic industry had operated without wartime restrictions or resource limitations. Tools, household equipment, clothing, and personal items were available in quantities and qualities that suggested industrial capacity devoted to civilian comfort that operated simultaneously with massive military production without apparent resource conflicts or production compromises that would have been inevitable in Japanese industrial systems. The housing observed during community visits revealed American construction standards and architectural sophistication that challenged Japanese assumptions about Western building techniques and resource allocation for civilian accommodation. Private homes contained central heating systems, electric lighting, indoor plumbing, and appliances that would have been luxury installations in upper-class Japanese residences, yet appeared to be standard equipment in middle-class American homes, owned by factory workers, farmers, and small business operators whose incomes would have supported only basic shelter in Japanese social systems. Lieutenant Tanaka's engineering background enabled him to appreciate the technical sophistication of American residential construction that incorporated advanced materials, precision manufacturing, and systematic installation techniques that exceeded Japanese building practices even for commercial and institutional construction projects. The casual deployment of advanced construction technology for routine residential applications suggested manufacturing capabilities in building materials and architectural engineering that made sophisticated housing economically feasible for ordinary citizens rather than being restricted to elite social classes. The retail establishments visited during community excursions demonstrated American commercial systems that operated with efficiency and abundance that seemed impossible based on Japanese understanding of wartime resource allocation and distribution priorities. Grocery stores contained food products in varieties and quantities that exceeded what Japanese consumers had available even during peacetime conditions, suggesting agricultural and transportation systems that maintained near-peacetime civilian food supplies while simultaneously supporting massive military operations across multiple global theaters requiring complex international logistics coordination. The interaction with American civilians provided Japanese prisoners with direct exposure to individual freedom and social attitudes that contradicted everything they had been taught about democratic societies and their supposed inability to maintain collective discipline during national emergencies. American citizens expressed personal opinions about government policies, military strategy, and war objectives without apparent fear of official retaliation, yet demonstrated patriotic support for military operations that seemed genuine rather than coerced through government propaganda and social pressure that characterized Japanese civilian attitudes toward official policies. The churches visited during Sunday community excursions revealed American religious freedom and institutional independence that challenged Japanese understanding of the relationship between spiritual authority and political control in effective national organization. Religious services proceeded without government supervision or ideological content that supported official war policies, yet congregations demonstrated spiritual commitment and community solidarity that seemed stronger than the enforced conformity that characterized Japanese religious and social institutions under military government control and ideological supervision. The schools observed during educational visits demonstrated American commitment to civilian education and intellectual development that continued at high levels despite wartime demands for industrial labor and military service that had forced most nations to reduce educational services and redirect intellectual resources toward immediate military application. Classroom equipment, teaching materials, and educational programs maintained peacetime standards while producing graduates whose technical skills and intellectual capabilities exceeded what Japanese educational systems achieved even during optimal peacetime conditions when resources could be concentrated on civilian development. The libraries and cultural institutions visited during community excursions provided Japanese prisoners with exposure to American intellectual resources and cultural sophistication that challenged propaganda about Western cultural limitations and artistic insensitivity. Book collections, musical programs, and artistic exhibitions demonstrated intellectual achievement and cultural development that exceeded what Japanese civilian institutions provided, suggesting educational and cultural industries that maintained high productivity levels while supporting massive military information and training requirements. The medical facilities observed during community visits revealed American healthcare capabilities that operated on scales and with technical sophistication that exceeded Japanese civilian medical services even during peacetime conditions when medical resources could be concentrated on civilian health care rather than military medical support. Hospitals contained equipment, supplies, and treatment capabilities that would have been available only in elite Japanese medical institutions, yet appeared to provide routine medical care for ordinary American citizens regardless of their economic status or social position. The industrial facilities visited during work-related community excursions provided Japanese prisoners with direct observation of American manufacturing operations that functioned at capacity levels and with technical sophistication that exceeded Japanese industrial capabilities even during peak wartime production, when all resources were concentrated on military manufacturing. Factory equipment, production techniques, and quality control systems demonstrated manufacturing philosophy that achieved superior results through systematic efficiency rather than through harsh labor discipline and resource conservation that characterized Japanese industrial management during wartime conditions. The transportation systems observed during community travel revealed American infrastructure development and mechanical reliability that operated on scales that defied Japanese comprehension of national resource allocation and engineering capabilities. Roads, bridges, rail systems, and vehicle maintenance demonstrated construction quality and systematic maintenance that supported transportation networks capable of simultaneous civilian commerce and military logistics without apparent conflicts or resource compromises that would have been inevitable in Japanese transportation systems during comparable military demands. The communication systems observed in civilian communities demonstrated American electronic capabilities and infrastructure investment that provided individual citizens with communication services that exceeded what Japanese military units possessed for essential operational coordination. Telephone service, radio broadcasting, and mail delivery operated with reliability and comprehensiveness that suggested communication industries that maintained near peacetime civilian services while supporting massive military communication. Requirements across global operations requiring complex international coordination and information security. The waste management systems observed in American communities revealed resource abundance in its most systematic form. Organized disposal and processing of materials that would have been valuable resources in Japan, managed through municipal services that treated comprehensive waste disposal as routine public service rather than luxury convenience available only during peacetime conditions. The systematic disposal of materials that would have been recycled or conserved in Japan demonstrated abundance that made comprehensive waste management economically feasible rather than strategically costly during wartime resource constraints. The psychological transformation reached its final and most devastating stage during Lieutenant Tanaka's 8th month at Camp McCoy, when American authorities introduced Japanese prisoners to the camp's repatriation preparation program, a systematic process designed to prepare former enemies for eventual return to Japan, while simultaneously exposing them to comprehensive documentation of American industrial capabilities that would make continued Japanese resistance mathematically impossible. Regardless of spiritual determination or tactical innovation, the repatriation preparation revealed that American officials had never intended permanent detention, but had systematically planned for the eventual return of prisoners who would carry first-hand knowledge of American abundance back to their homeland as unwitting intelligence agents whose testimony would undermine Japanese war morale more effectively than any propaganda campaign. The educational component of repatriation preparation provided Japanese prisoners with access to detailed information about American industrial production, agricultural output, and technological capabilities that exceeded what Japanese intelligence services had gathered through years of espionage activities and strategic analysis. Statistical data, technical specifications, and production figures were presented through lectures and documentation that revealed American industrial capacity operating at levels that made Japanese resistance strategically futile, regardless of tactical skill or ideological commitment. The casual presentation of such strategic information suggested either supreme confidence in American technological superiority or fundamental indifference to security concerns about intelligence transfer to enemy personnel. Sergeant Yamamoto participated in industrial seminars that provided detailed analysis of American manufacturing techniques, production systems, and organizational methods that exceeded Japanese industrial capabilities by margins that seemed impossible based on pre-war intelligence estimates and strategic planning assumptions. The manufacturing philosophy emphasized systematic efficiency achieved through worker cooperation and technological innovation, rather than harsh discipline and resource conservation that characterized Japanese industrial management during wartime conditions. The systematic sharing of advanced industrial knowledge with enemy prisoners demonstrated intellectual abundance that paralleled the material prosperity evident throughout their captivity experience. The agricultural education program revealed American farming capabilities that operated on scales and with technological sophistication that made Japanese concerns about food security and territorial expansion strategically irrelevant. Production statistics, mechanical farming techniques, and distribution systems demonstrated agricultural industries that could feed both American civilian populations and global military forces while maintaining abundance sufficient to provide superior nutrition for enemy prisoners whose welfare provided no strategic benefit for American war objectives. The systematic documentation of agricultural superiority suggested food production capabilities that made territorial conquest unnecessary for national survival and prosperity. Lieutenant Tanaka's participation in technical training programs provided direct exposure to American engineering capabilities and scientific research that exceeded Japanese technological development by decades in many critical areas, including electronics, metallurgy, chemical processing, and precision manufacturing. The training materials included information about research and development programs that were producing technological innovations at rates that Japanese scientific institutions could not match even with unlimited resource allocation and complete focus on military applications. The casual sharing of advanced technical knowledge suggested scientific capabilities that made technology transfer to former enemies economically insignificant compared to total research and development capacity. The psychological evaluation component of repatriation preparation revealed American scientific understanding of human behavior and systematic approaches to cultural transformation that had been documenting and analyzing the mental changes experienced by Japanese prisoners throughout their captivity period. The evaluations tracked ideological evolution, attitude modifications, and belief system changes that demonstrated psychological warfare capabilities operating at levels of sophistication that exceeded Japanese understanding of human motivation and social control mechanisms. The systematic study of prisoner transformation suggested scientific resources devoted to psychological research that seemed inconsistent with the immediate military requirements of global warfare. The documentation provided for repatriation included detailed records of prisoner experiences, treatment received, and observations made during captivity that would serve as comprehensive intelligence reports about American capabilities when prisoners returned to Japan and shared their experiences with military authorities and civilian populations. The systematic documentation suggested long-term strategic planning that anticipated the psychological impact of prisoner testimony on Japanese morale and continued resistance efforts. The willingness to provide such documentation demonstrated confidence that first-hand accounts of American abundance would serve American strategic objectives more effectively than traditional propaganda techniques. The medical examinations conducted during repatriation preparation demonstrated American health care capabilities that ensured Japanese prisoners would return to their homeland in better physical condition than when they were captured, despite months of captivity and the stress of cultural displacement. Comprehensive medical care, dental work, and nutritional supplementation provided treatment that exceeded what Japanese military medical services offered to active personnel, creating stark contrasts that would be immediately apparent when former prisoners rejoined Japanese forces operating under increasingly severe resource limitations and medical supply shortages. The clothing and personal equipment provided for repatriation included items manufactured to specifications that exceeded Japanese military equipment in quality, durability, and functionality, ensuring that returning prisoners would possess material evidence of American manufacturing superiority that could be examined and analyzed by Japanese technical personnel. The systematic provision of superior equipment suggested manufacturing capabilities that could afford to equip former enemies with goods that demonstrated American industrial advantages through direct physical comparison with Japanese equivalents. The transportation arrangements for repatriation revealed American logistical capabilities that could coordinate complex international movements of personnel across thousands of miles using multiple transportation systems that functioned with precision that exceeded Japanese logistics coordination even for critical military operations. The systematic coordination of prisoner repatriation suggested administrative capabilities and international cooperation that made complex multinational operations routine rather than exceptional, achievements requiring extraordinary resource allocation and organizational effort. The financial support provided for repatriation included wages accumulated during prisoner work assignments that exceeded the earnings Japanese soldiers received during active military service, creating immediate economic comparisons that would demonstrate American resource abundance when former prisoners attempted to support their families using accumulated American wages. The systematic provision of superior compensation for enemy prisoners suggested economic systems that could afford generous treatment for individuals whose welfare provided no strategic advantage for American military objectives. The cultural exchange programs expanded during repatriation preparation, provided Japanese prisoners with comprehensive exposure to American social institutions, educational systems, and cultural achievements that challenged fundamental assumptions about Western civilization and democratic society's capacity for sophisticated intellectual and artistic development. The systematic sharing of cultural knowledge suggested educational resources and intellectual capabilities that exceeded Japanese institutional development despite democratic political systems that Japanese propaganda had portrayed as inherently inferior to authoritarian organization and social control. The correspondence facilitated during repatriation preparation enabled Japanese prisoners to communicate extensively with family members and military colleagues, sharing detailed accounts of American treatment and observations of American capabilities that would reach Japanese audiences as credible intelligence from trusted sources rather than enemy propaganda that could be dismissed as deceptive. Information warfare. The systematic facilitation of prisoner communication suggested strategic understanding of psychological warfare that used honest testimony rather than deceptive propaganda to achieve desired effects on enemy morale and continued resistance efforts. The timing of repatriation activities coordinated with major American military victories that demonstrated the practical application of industrial superiority that prisoners had witnessed during their captivity, creating psychological connections between observed American capabilities and battlefield results that made Japanese defeat appear inevitable rather than temporary setback, requiring renewed effort and sacrifice. The systematic timing of repatriation with military success suggested strategic coordination between psychological warfare and conventional military operations that maximize the impact of prisoner testimony on Japanese civilian and military audiences. The final revelation came during Lieutenant Tanaka's last weeks at Camp McCoy, when American authorities provided Japanese prisoners with comprehensive access to current war news through newspapers, radio broadcasts, and documentary films that revealed the true scope of American military operations and the mathematical impossibility of Japanese victory based on production statistics and strategic analysis that contradicted every assumption about American military limitations and industrial constraints. The systematic provision of uncensored information about American military success demonstrated confidence in the psychological impact of truth, rather than reliance on propaganda or information manipulation to achieve desired effects on prisoner attitudes and eventual testimony upon repatriation. The newspaper access provided daily documentation of American military progress across multiple theaters of operation, with detailed reporting that included production statistics, casualty figures, and strategic analysis that revealed American capabilities exceeding Japanese intelligence estimates by margins that made continued resistance strategically futile regardless of tactical improvements or increased sacrifice by Japanese military forces. The casual availability of such comprehensive military information to enemy prisoners suggested either supreme confidence in American strategic superiority or fundamental indifference to security concerns about intelligence availability to former enemy personnel who would eventually return to Japan with detailed knowledge of American capabilities. Sergeant Yamamoto found himself reading detailed accounts of American aircraft production that exceeded Japanese manufacturing by ratios that seemed impossible based on pre-war industrial assessments and strategic planning assumptions. Monthly production figures for bombers, fighters, and transport aircraft demonstrated manufacturing capabilities that could replace combat losses faster than Japanese forces could inflict them, making attrition warfare mathematically favorable to American forces regardless of Japanese tactical skill or pilot courage. The systematic documentation of production superiority suggested industrial capacity that made numerical advantage inevitable rather than dependent on strategic resource allocation or manufacturing efficiency improvements. The radio broadcasts provided real-time updates on military operations that demonstrated American logistical capabilities coordinating simultaneous campaigns across the Pacific, European, and Mediterranean theaters while maintaining supply lines that functioned with reliability that exceeded Japanese domestic transportation systems during peacetime conditions. The complexity of global operations requiring coordination across multiple time zones, climate conditions, and operational requirements suggested organizational capabilities that exceeded Japanese military administration even for single theater operations with simplified logistics and communication. Requirements: Lieutenant Tanaka listened to detailed reports about American naval operations that revealed shipbuilding capabilities, producing vessels faster than submarine warfare could sink them, making Allied naval superiority inevitable regardless of Japanese tactical innovations or increased submarine production. The systematic replacement of naval losses with improved designs and enhanced capabilities demonstrated industrial philosophy that treated material losses as temporary inconveniences rather than strategic setbacks requiring reduced operational tempo or modified strategic objectives. The documentary films provided visual evidence of American industrial operations that exceeded Japanese comprehension of manufacturing capacity and organizational efficiency, with footage of assembly lines, factory operations, and production systems that achieved output levels impossible based on Japanese understanding of industrial limitations and resource constraints. The casual documentation of manufacturing processes suggested confidence in industrial superiority that made information sharing with enemy prisoners strategically beneficial rather than security risks, requiring information control and deception. The statistical briefings provided during final repatriation preparation included comprehensive data about American agricultural production, industrial output, and resource availability that revealed the mathematical foundation of American military superiority and the impossibility of Japanese victory through any conceivable improvement in efficiency, sacrifice, or tactical innovation. The systematic presentation of strategic data suggested long-term planning that anticipated the psychological impact of comprehensive information on Japanese audiences when former prisoners shared their knowledge upon return to their homeland. The comparison charts provided detailed analysis of American versus Japanese production capabilities in every critical category of military equipment, revealing American advantages that exceeded Japanese capacity by margins that made strategic parity impossible, regardless of resource reallocation or industrial efficiency improvement. Tank production, aircraft manufacturing, naval construction, and ammunition production all demonstrated American superiority at levels that made Japanese military resistance mathematically futile despite spiritual determination and tactical skill. The economic briefings revealed American financial capabilities and resource allocation systems that could sustain global warfare indefinitely without reducing civilian living standards or implementing the harsh rationing measures that had become necessary throughout Japanese society. The systematic documentation of economic abundance suggested industrial and agricultural systems operating at capacity levels that made wartime sacrifice unnecessary rather than patriotic virtue, requiring individual hardship for collective survival. The technological demonstrations provided Japanese prisoners with direct exposure to American scientific capabilities and research programs that were producing innovations at rates that exceeded Japanese scientific development despite resource allocation focused entirely on military applications and strategic research priorities. Radar systems, communication equipment, medical innovations, and manufacturing techniques demonstrated scientific capabilities that suggested American technological superiority would continue expanding regardless of Japanese efforts to close technological gaps through increased research investment. The logistics presentations revealed American transportation and supply systems that could deliver materials and personnel across global distances with reliability that exceeded Japanese domestic transportation during peacetime conditions, making American military operations sustainable regardless of geographic challenges or enemy interdiction efforts. The systematic coordination of complex international logistics suggested organizational capabilities that made global warfare manageable rather than overwhelming administrative challenge, requiring extraordinary effort and resource concentration. The intelligence briefings provided information about American code-breaking capabilities, reconnaissance systems, and information gathering that had penetrated Japanese military communications and strategic planning to degrees that made operational security ineffective regardless of communication, discipline, improvements, or encryption technique modification. The systematic penetration of Japanese military information suggested intelligence capabilities that made strategic surprise impossible and tactical coordination transparent to American military planning. The prisoner exchange negotiations revealed American diplomatic capabilities and international cooperation that had established communication channels with Japanese authorities despite active warfare conditions, suggesting political and administrative systems that could maintain complex international relationships while conducting total warfare across multiple theaters, requiring complete resource mobilization. The systematic maintenance of diplomatic communication suggested governmental capabilities that made negotiated solutions possible rather than requiring unconditional military victory through complete enemy destruction. The final medical examination provided comprehensive health care that ensured Japanese prisoners would return to their homeland in better physical condition than active Japanese military personnel, creating immediate physical evidence of American resource abundance when compared to medical care available to Japanese forces operating under severe supply limitations and medical shortage conditions. The systematic provision of superior medical care suggested healthcare industries that could afford comprehensive treatment for enemy prisoners while maintaining military medical support at levels that exceeded Japanese capabilities. The departure preparations included detailed documentation of prisoner experiences that would serve as comprehensive intelligence reports when shared with Japanese military authorities and civilian populations, providing first-hand accounts of American capabilities that would be more credible than official intelligence reports or propaganda assessments. The systematic documentation of prisoner treatment suggested strategic understanding of psychological warfare that used honest testimony rather than deceptive information to achieve desired effects on enemy morale and continued resistance efforts. The final psychological evaluations documented the complete transformation of Japanese prisoners from confident enemy combatants to individuals who understood the mathematical impossibility of Japanese victory and the strategic necessity of surrender. Negotiations, rather than continued military resistance that would only increase destruction without changing ultimate outcomes. The systematic measurement of psychological transformation suggested scientific understanding of human behavior that exceeded Japanese knowledge of social control and ideological influence. The repatriation journey itself became the final chapter in Lieutenant Tanaka's psychological transformation, as he and 847 other Japanese prisoners were transported aboard the hospital ship USS Comfort, a floating medical facility that demonstrated American humanitarian capabilities and technological sophistication that exceeded Japanese naval medical services even during peacetime conditions when resources could be concentrated on optimal patient care rather than emergency battlefield treatment. The ship's medical facilities, patient accommodations, and treatment protocols revealed systematic attention to individual welfare that challenged every assumption about American military priorities and resource allocation during global warfare, requiring maximum efficiency and strategic focus. The USS Comfort contained medical equipment and treatment capabilities that exceeded what Japanese naval hospitals possessed for treating their own personnel, with surgical facilities, diagnostic equipment, and pharmaceutical supplies that represented American medical manufacturing capacity devoted to humanitarian purposes rather than strategic military advantage. The systematic provision of superior medical care for enemy prisoners during repatriation suggested healthcare industries that could afford elaborate treatment for individuals whose welfare provided no strategic benefit for American military objectives, while simultaneously supporting military medical requirements across multiple theaters of operation. Sergeant Yamamoto found himself assigned to quarters that would have been officer accommodations on Japanese naval vessels, with individual bunks, climate control, and personal storage that exceeded what Japanese military personnel received even on flagship vessels carrying senior command staff. The casual provision of comfortable accommodations for enemy prisoners suggested naval construction capabilities that could afford luxury features for humanitarian transport while simultaneously producing combat vessels at rates that exceeded Japanese shipbuilding capacity by margins that made naval parity mathematically impossible. The food service aboard the USS Comfort continued the pattern of abundance that had characterized their entire captivity experience, with meals that exceeded Japanese naval rations in quality, variety, and nutritional content, despite the additional complexity of shipboard food preparation and storage during extended ocean voyage. Fresh vegetables, dairy products, and meat were available in quantities that would have supported Japanese naval units for extended periods, suggesting agricultural and logistics systems that could maintain food abundance even under the challenging conditions of ocean transportation and limited storage capacity. Lieutenant Tanaka observed the ship's operations with the analytical perspective of a naval officer trained in maritime systems and logistics coordination, noting operational efficiency and technical sophistication that exceeded Japanese naval capabilities in every measurable category, including navigation, communication, damage control, and administrative organization. The systematic superiority of American naval operations suggested manufacturing and training programs that produced vessels and personnel capable of performance levels that Japanese naval forces had never achieved despite decades of preparation and resource investment in naval development. The medical staff aboard the USS Comfort included physicians and nurses whose training and expertise exceeded what Japanese naval medical services provided for their own personnel, with specializations in trauma surgery, infectious disease treatment, and psychiatric care that represented educational and scientific capabilities beyond Japanese medical development. The systematic provision of advanced medical expertise for enemy prisoner transport suggested educational institutions and medical research programs that could produce specialized personnel while simultaneously supporting military medical requirements across global operations. The communication systems linking the USS Comfort with American naval commands, medical facilities, and diplomatic authorities demonstrated electronic capabilities that functioned with reliability that exceeded Japanese naval communications even under optimal conditions with minimal interference and perfect weather. Radio transmissions, navigation coordination, and administrative reporting operated with precision that suggested manufacturing and technical training programs that produced electronic systems and personnel capable of performance levels that Japanese technology had struggled to achieve. The navigation equipment and procedures observed during the voyage revealed American maritime technology and seamanship that exceeded Japanese naval capabilities despite decades of Japanese focus on naval development and maritime warfare preparation. Radar systems, navigation instruments, and ship handling techniques demonstrated technological sophistication and professional competence that made American naval operations more effective than Japanese equivalents, despite comparable strategic priorities and resource investment in naval capabilities. The interaction with American naval personnel provided Japanese prisoners with direct exposure to military culture and individual attitudes that contradicted everything they had been taught about democratic military organization and its supposed inability to maintain discipline and effectiveness during extended combat operations. American sailors demonstrated professional competence, unit cohesion, and individual initiative that exceeded Japanese naval performance despite operating under military systems that allowed individual expression and personal freedom that would have been considered dangerous to unit discipline in Japanese naval culture. The maintenance systems aboard the USS Comfort revealed American manufacturing quality and technical support that kept complex medical and naval systems operating with reliability that exceeded Japanese naval maintenance capabilities even for flagship vessels receiving priority resource allocation and technical attention. Spare parts, technical manuals, and maintenance procedures demonstrated manufacturing philosophy that prioritized long-term reliability over initial cost considerations and resource conservation that characterized Japanese naval maintenance during wartime conditions. The waste management systems aboard the hospital ship continued the pattern of resource abundance that had characterized their entire captivity experience, with systematic disposal of materials that would have been valuable resources on Japanese vessels operating under strict conservation protocols and resource rationing requirements. Food waste, medical supplies, and general refuse were processed through organized disposal systems that treated comprehensive waste management as routine shipboard operation rather than luxury service, available only during peacetime conditions. The recreational facilities available during the voyage provided Japanese prisoners with continued exposure to American military culture that emphasized individual welfare and morale maintenance as integral components of military effectiveness, rather than unnecessary luxuries that diverted resources from essential combat preparation. Library services, recreational equipment, and social activities were provided without restriction based on prisoner status or cooperation with American authorities, suggesting military philosophy that treated individual satisfaction as strategically beneficial rather than potential security risk. The medical treatment provided during the voyage included comprehensive health monitoring and preventive care that ensured Japanese prisoners would arrive in Japan in optimal physical condition despite the stress of ocean, transportation, and cultural displacement. Routine medical examinations, prescription medications, and attention to minor health issues demonstrated medical capabilities that exceeded what Japanese naval medical services provided for active personnel during comparable voyage. Conditions and operational stress. The arrival preparations included detailed briefings about conditions in Japan based on American intelligence gathering and diplomatic communication that revealed comprehensive knowledge of Japanese domestic conditions, military capabilities, and civilian morale that exceeded what Japanese prisoners possessed about their own homeland after months of captivity and limited communication. The systematic provision of current information about Japanese conditions suggested intelligence capabilities that made Japanese military security ineffective despite communication discipline and information control efforts. The psychological counseling provided during final voyage preparations addressed the emotional challenges of returning to a homeland that would be different from their memories and expectations, with professional support that demonstrated American understanding of human psychology and cultural readjustment difficulties that exceeded Japanese military attention to individual psychological welfare. The systematic provision of psychological support suggested scientific capabilities, and humanitarian concerns that seemed inconsistent with efficient military organization during total warfare. Conditions. The documentation provided for Japanese authorities included detailed medical records, treatment histories, and psychological evaluations that would serve as comprehensive intelligence about American capabilities and prisoner treatment when reviewed by Japanese military and civilian officials responsible for prisoner welfare and strategic assessment. The systematic documentation suggested confidence that honest reporting of prisoner treatment would serve American strategic objectives more effectively than propaganda or information manipulation designed to create false impressions about American capabilities and intentions. The final approach to Japanese waters in the spring of 1944 provided Lieutenant Tanaka and his fellow repatriated prisoners with their most devastating psychological revelation: the stark contrast between the abundance they had experienced during American captivity and the visible evidence of Japanese homeland conditions that revealed the true scope of American strategic bombing, effectiveness, and Japanese industrial collapse. Through the porthole of the USS Comfort, Japanese prisoners observed their homeland's coastline marked by destroyed industrial facilities, darkened cities operating under strict blackout conditions, and naval installations that appeared abandoned or severely damaged, compared to the bustling American military installations they had witnessed during their captivity. Experience. The harbor facilities visible during their approach to the exchange point revealed Japanese industrial infrastructure that had been systematically destroyed by American bombing campaigns, with dock facilities, shipyards, and port installations showing damage that would have been impossible based on Japanese pre-war assessments of American strategic bombing capabilities and their own air defense systems. The systematic destruction of coastal industrial facilities demonstrated American strategic bombing effectiveness that exceeded Japanese defensive capabilities despite years of preparation and resource investment in anti-aircraft systems and fighter interceptor programs designed to protect critical industrial infrastructure. Sergeant Yamamoto observed Japanese naval vessels in port that appeared to be operating under severe fuel and maintenance limitations, with ships showing visible signs of inadequate maintenance and reduced operational status that contrasted sharply with the pristine condition and obvious operational readiness of American naval vessels they had encountered throughout their captivity and repatriation experience. The deteriorated condition of Japanese naval forces suggested resource shortages and industrial capacity limitations that made effective naval operations increasingly difficult despite continued official pronouncements about Japanese military strength and strategic capabilities. The Japanese military personnel who came aboard the USS Comfort for the prisoner exchange appeared undernourished and poorly equipped compared to the American military personnel who had supervised their captivity and repatriation, with uniforms showing signs of material shortages and equipment that appeared to be manufactured using substitute materials and reduced quality standards. The visible decline in Japanese military appearance and equipment quality provided immediate physical evidence of industrial capacity limitations and resource allocation problems that had not been apparent in official Japanese military communications and propaganda presentations. Lieutenant Tanaka found himself comparing the professional appearance and obvious health of American military personnel with the Japanese officials conducting the prisoner exchange, noting differences in nutrition, medical care, and equipment quality that suggested systematic advantages in American military support systems and individual welfare programs. The immediate visual comparison between American and Japanese military personnel provided stark evidence of the industrial and organizational superiority that prisoners had experienced during their captivity, but had not fully understood until this direct comparison. Opportunity. The medical examination facilities provided by Japanese authorities for returning prisoners demonstrated medical capabilities and resource availability that fell short of the standard medical care prisoners had received routinely during American captivity, with equipment supplies, and treatment protocols that appeared primitive compared to American military medical services they had experienced. The systematic inferiority of Japanese medical capabilities became immediately apparent through direct comparison with American medical treatment that had been provided without rationing or resource limitations throughout their captivity period. The food provided during the exchange process revealed Japanese resource limitations and agricultural capacity, problems that contrasted dramatically with the abundant meals prisoners had received throughout their American captivity experience, with portions that seemed inadequate compared to American prisoner rations, and quality that suggested substitute ingredients and reduced nutritional standards. The immediate contrast in food quality and quantity provided tangible evidence of resource scarcity that made continued Japanese military operations increasingly difficult despite official reassurances about agricultural production and civilian food security. The transportation arrangements for returning prisoners revealed Japanese logistics limitations and fuel shortages that contrasted sharply with the reliable and comfortable transportation systems they had experienced during American captivity, with vehicles that appeared to be operating under strict fuel rationing and maintenance limitations that affected operational reliability and passenger comfort. The systematic limitations of Japanese transportation capabilities suggested resource allocation problems that would affect military logistics and civilian mobility regardless of strategic planning improvements or organizational efficiency measures. The communication systems observed during the exchange process demonstrated Japanese electronic capabilities that appeared primitive compared to American communication equipment they had observed during captivity, with radio systems that functioned with less reliability and administrative coordination that seemed less efficient than American military communications they had witnessed. The obvious inferiority of Japanese communication capabilities suggested technological limitations that would affect military coordination and strategic planning, regardless of tactical skill improvements or increased training efforts. The industrial facilities visible from the exchange location showed evidence of systematic bombing damage and reduced operational capacity that contrasted dramatically with the American industrial facilities they had observed during work assignments and community visits, with factory buildings showing destruction and abandoned equipment that suggested manufacturing capacity reductions that would affect military production regardless of resource reallocation or efficiency improvements. The visible industrial damage provided immediate evidence of American strategic bombing effectiveness that had not been apparent in Japanese official reports about industrial production and military manufacturing capabilities. The civilian populations observed during brief shore interactions appeared to be suffering from malnutrition and material shortages that contrasted sharply with the American civilian prosperity they had witnessed during community visits, with clothing showing signs of material rationing and physical appearance suggesting reduced caloric intake and limited access to consumer goods. The immediate visual evidence of civilian hardship provided stark contrast with American civilian abundance that had seemed impossible based on Japanese pre-war assessments of American social organization and wartime sacrifice capabilities. The psychological impact of returning to homeland conditions that were obviously inferior to their captivity experience created emotional conflicts that challenged fundamental assumptions about loyalty, patriotism, and national strength that had shaped their military service and personal identity throughout their adult lives. The immediate contrast between American abundance and Japanese scarcity made continued military resistance appear futile regardless of spiritual determination or tactical innovation that might improve battlefield performance without addressing underlying resource limitations. The debriefing sessions conducted by Japanese military intelligence revealed official surprise at prisoner accounts of American industrial capabilities and resource abundance that exceeded Japanese intelligence estimates by margins that made previous strategic planning assumptions invalid regardless of tactical adjustments or operational improvement. The systematic questioning about American capabilities suggested that Japanese military leadership had not understood the true scope of American industrial superiority that made continued resistance strategically pointless, despite continued official pronouncements about eventual Japanese victory. The medical examinations conducted by Japanese military physicians revealed that returning prisoners were in better physical condition than active Japanese military personnel, despite months of captivity and the stress of cultural displacement, providing immediate evidence of superior American medical care and nutritional support that exceeded Japanese military support systems. The systematic superiority of prisoner physical condition challenged assumptions about American treatment of captured enemies and revealed resource abundance that made comprehensive medical care economically feasible for individuals whose welfare provided no strategic advantage. The psychological evaluations conducted by Japanese military psychiatrists documented the ideological transformation experienced by prisoners exposed to American abundance and humanitarian treatment, revealing attitude changes that challenged fundamental assumptions about American character and strategic capabilities that had shaped Japanese military planning and propaganda presentation. The systematic documentation of psychological transformation suggested that first-hand exposure to American capabilities had achieved more effective ideological impact than years of combat experience and military indoctrination designed to maintain fighting spirit despite battlefield setbacks. The ultimate psychological devastation came during Lieutenant Tanaka's first weeks back in Japan, when he discovered that his detailed accounts of American industrial abundance and humanitarian treatment were being systematically suppressed by Japanese military authorities who recognized that truthful prisoner testimony would undermine civilian morale and military resistance more effectively than any American propaganda campaign could achieve. The systematic censorship of prisoner experiences revealed Japanese military leadership's understanding that honest accounts of American capabilities would make continued resistance appear strategically futile to civilian populations already suffering under severe rationing and resource limitations that contrasted dramatically with the abundance prisoners had experienced during captivity. Sergeant Yamamoto found himself confined to a military facility where returning prisoners underwent extensive debriefing and ideological re-education designed to minimize the psychological impact of American treatment and restore faith in Japanese military capabilities despite overwhelming evidence of American industrial superiority. The systematic attempt to counteract prisoner testimony through official propaganda and restricted communication revealed Japanese recognition that first-hand accounts of American abundance posed greater threats to national morale than military defeats or strategic bombing campaigns that could be portrayed as temporary setbacks requiring renewed sacrifice and determination. The contrast between official Japanese assessments of American weakness and prisoner testimony about American abundance created cognitive dissonance among Japanese military personnel and civilian officials who received detailed briefings about prisoner experiences but were required to maintain public pronouncements about eventual Japanese victory despite mathematical evidence that continued resistance would only increase destruction without changing ultimate outcomes. The systematic contradiction between private knowledge and public statements revealed the complete collapse of Japanese strategic confidence despite continued official optimism and propaganda presentations designed to maintain civilian support. Lieutenant Tanaka's attempts to share technical information about American manufacturing capabilities and industrial organization were met with skepticism from Japanese engineers and military planners who found prisoner accounts impossible to reconcile with official intelligence estimates and strategic planning assumptions that had shaped Japanese war strategy. The systematic rejection of prisoner testimony, despite its obvious credibility and detailed technical accuracy, revealed Japanese institutional inability to accept evidence that challenged fundamental assumptions about national strength and strategic capabilities that had justified military aggression and territorial expansion. The medical examinations revealing that returning prisoners were healthier than active Japanese military personnel created embarrassing comparisons that Japanese military medical services attempted to suppress through restricted communication and limited prisoner contact with active military units. The systematic concealment of prisoner physical condition revealed Japanese recognition that evidence of superior American medical care would challenge military morale and civilian confidence in Japanese institutional capabilities to provide adequate support for military personnel during extended warfare conditions. The letters from family members describing conditions in Japanese cities under American bombing revealed civilian populations suffering hardships that exceeded what prisoners had experienced during captivity, creating psychological conflicts about duty, sacrifice, and national service that challenged fundamental assumptions about military obligation and patriotic responsibility. The systematic superiority of prisoner treatment compared to civilian conditions revealed the mathematical impossibility of Japanese military victory when enemies could afford to provide captured personnel with living standards that exceeded what Japanese citizens enjoyed in their own homeland. The industrial facilities that Lieutenant Tanaka visited during his reintegration process showed visible evidence of systematic destruction and resource limitations that confirmed American strategic bombing effectiveness and Japanese industrial collapse that had been concealed through official reports, emphasizing continued production and military manufacturing capabilities. The direct observation of Japanese industrial weakness provided conclusive evidence that prisoner accounts of American abundance were accurate, and that continued resistance would only delay inevitable defeat while increasing civilian casualties and national destruction. The communication with other returning prisoners revealed universal testimony about American capabilities that created networks of first-hand knowledge about enemy strength that could not be suppressed. Despite official censorship and restricted prisoner movement designed to limit the spread of demoralizing information, the systematic consistency of prisoner accounts despite geographical separation and independent observation provided compelling evidence that American industrial superiority was genuine, rather than elaborate deception designed to achieve psychological warfare objectives through false impressions. The psychological counseling provided by Japanese military psychiatrists attempted to restore confidence in Japanese victory through ideological reinforcement and patriotic inspiration, but proved ineffective against first-hand experience of American abundance that had demonstrated the mathematical futility of continued resistance regardless of spiritual determination or tactical innovation. The systematic failure of ideological restoration efforts revealed the permanent psychological impact of exposure to American industrial capabilities that had fundamentally altered prisoner understanding of national strength and strategic possibilities. The gradual realization that his captivity experience had been representative rather than exceptional treatment for American prisoners revealed the true scope of American resource abundance and organizational capabilities that could afford humanitarian treatment for thousands of enemy captives while simultaneously conducting global military operations requiring unprecedented logistics coordination and industrial production. The systematic provision of superior treatment for captured enemies demonstrated American confidence in ultimate victory and resource abundance that made comprehensive prisoner welfare economically feasible rather than strategic sacrifice. The WWII comparison between American treatment of Japanese prisoners and Japanese treatment of American captives revealed moral and organizational superiority that challenged fundamental assumptions about national character and institutional effectiveness that had justified Japanese military aggression and territorial expansion. The systematic difference in prisoner treatment revealed American humanitarian capabilities and resource abundance that exceeded Japanese capacity for basic military support despite official propaganda about Japanese spiritual superiority and Western moral corruption. The final psychological transformation came with Lieutenant Tanaka's recognition that American abundance was not temporary wartime prosperity that would collapse under pressure, but systematic industrial capacity that represented permanent American advantages in any prolonged conflict with resource-limited nations attempting territorial expansion through military conquest. The mathematical certainty of American victory through industrial attrition rather than battlefield heroics revealed the futility of continued Japanese resistance that could only delay inevitable surrender while increasing civilian casualties and national destruction. The knowledge that thousands of other Japanese prisoners were undergoing similar psychological transformations and would return to Japan with identical testimony about American capabilities created inevitable multiplication of demoralizing information that would spread throughout Japanese military and civilian populations despite official censorship efforts. The systematic return of transformed prisoners would serve American strategic objectives more effectively than conventional military operations by undermining Japanese confidence in ultimate victory through first-hand testimony that could not be dismissed as enemy propaganda. The ultimate revelation was that American officials had planned this psychological transformation from the beginning, using abundant treatment and systematic exposure to industrial capabilities as strategic weapons more powerful than bombs or bullets in achieving total enemy demoralization and surrender. The hot showers, clean beds, abundant food, and humanitarian treatment had been calculated psychological warfare that transformed captured enemies into unwitting intelligence, agents whose testimony would achieve American victory through mathematical demonstration of industrial superiority rather than battlefield destruction. The terror was not in American brutality, but in American abundance that made continued resistance genuinely pointless.